My teaching and writing has been in the area of environmental law, both domestic environmental law and international environmental law. My focus, though, is on environmental justice. And what I mean by that is that the environmental problems that I'm concerned about are the problems that affect the most vulnerable communities in every country of the world. All too often, environmental issues have been perceived as issues that concern only the elite, that are about preserving nature for nature's sake, preserving national parks so that middle and upper class hikers can enjoy them, and not really thinking about the fact that those who are most directly impacted by environmental degradation of every sort, climate change being perhaps the best example, are those who are poor, indigenous peoples, small island states, people who don't have the resources for adaptation and for responses to disaster. Even in wealthy countries, we see this pattern very starkly. We all remember Hurricane Katrina in the United States that hit the city of New Orleans, and the people who were left behind were largely poor and African American. Yet all too often, environmental legislation and environmental treaties adopt a very technocratic approach that doesn't take into account the people who are affected, the ways that environmental degradation affects some more than others, and the ways that even the solutions to environmental problems can inflict more harm on vulnerable communities. So for example, using climate change as an example, there are a number of green energy projects that are successful, at least ostensibly, in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But their impacts on people who are already suffering from climate change are egregious. Dams, for example, hydroelectric dams that cause massive amounts of displacement. Biofuels plantations that dispossess small farmers who are left food insecure as a result. Wind farms located on indigenous lands that deprive people of access to farmland and deprive them of access to sacred sites. Many of these projects are proceeding as solutions to the problem of climate change, but because they're not integrated into a human rights framework, because they're top-down rather than bottom-up, they are producing immense amounts of dislocation to those who are already suffering significant injuries because of climate change. So my work is to reconceptualize the way that we think about environmental protection. Environmental law in general is often fragmented. We have economic law in one area, environmental law, and human rights law. They operate with distinct legal frameworks, distinct institutions, distinct groups of policymakers, completely separate from one another. Economic law tends to be predominant. It has the institutions that have real teeth, real economic sanctions if there's a violation. Environmental law, human rights law operate in a softer mode with institutions that are designed to encourage or to name and shame those who violate their obligations. What I'd like to see is an integration of these principles, because without that integration, what we do in the area, the advances that are made in the environmental area and the area of human rights are completely undermined by the economic institutions that function in a business as usual model, as if we weren't experiencing environmental problems of such magnitude that scientists call the current era the Anthropocene. For the first time in human history, human beings are driving ecological change. And we are exceeding the limits of the planet's ecosystem to enable our economies to thrive and to enable people to thrive. And so what I'm trying to do in my work is to do an integration, to present critical perspectives on environmental law, but also critical perspectives on economic law that bring together these disparate areas that should not be disparate, so that instead of tinkering on the margins, we're actually going to the root of the problem and looking at dysfunctional systems of economic governance that produce poverty rather than wealth, that increase inequality rather than decreasing it, that cause us to exceed ecosystem limits, and that produce massive and systemic violations of human rights.